The misuse of terms. One of the reasons why I provide all of this information to you in respect of narcissism and psychopathy is because there's a huge amount of misunderstanding about the subjects. This is because there are those which create a platform having been on the receiving end of the behaviour of a narcissist, and, understandably, but actually not logically for them, they want to tell the world about their experience. The problem with this is that invariably all they do is explain what has happened to them and regurgitate information that they've learned themselves about narcissism from elsewhere, often repeating errors. Such individuals, of course, are well-intentioned, but the problem is that they're actually keeping themselves held back because they're continuing to immerse themselves in narcissism without actually getting full answers, which is what they would receive from me. Furthermore, by repeatedly talking and writing about their own experience, they're breaching their no-contact regime without actually getting logical responses and answers. Accordingly, they're not helping themselves, and the help that they offer to other people is minimal, because they can't provide all of the answers because they simply don't know them. They also aren't bringing anything new to the party. All they're doing is regurgitating what has occurred before, what they've read elsewhere, and of course, whilst they may provide validation to some people, my experience was the same as this person's, ultimately there are many factors which suggest they ought not to do this. There are of course then the professionals that do have some understanding about narcissism, although it varies wildly amongst those who are psychologists, psychiatrists and psychotherapists. A number of these individuals, of course, have not actually lived the experience, and therefore, whilst they talk about it, they do so in a rather detached and disjointed manner. Furthermore, there are also gaps in the information that they provide. We then have the third group, which invariably is the most problematic. These are the unaware narcissists that believe that they are victims. Naturally, their narcissism wants them to talk about their experience because it enables them to assert control over people and draw fuel from them, also gaining character traits and potentially residual benefits, and causes them to set up a platform whereby they talk about their experience as if they are the victim. In some instances, they may well have been the victim of a narcissist, but more usually, it is a perception that they are the victim of an actual true victim. And all these individuals do is propagate myths and misunderstandings about narcissism driven by their own unaware narcissistic perspective. It is these individuals that are particularly unhelpful because they portray the narcissist as something often more than they actually are. For instance, suggesting that each and every narcissist will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Very few will, for reasons that I've explained elsewhere. Accordingly, there's a massive information that's provided which is either wrong, partially incorrect, or has aspects missing. And all of this is problematic for you. This is where my work comes along. Able to explain to you as a consequence of the insight that I have about myself and my kind, and doing so as a consequence of my anonymity, I'm able to tell you all about it with no negative repercussions for me. I'm also able to do so as part of the extension of my legacy. And of course I've undertaken this work because I actually find it offensive that people fail to explain the behaviours of my kind properly and in detail, and thus I have filled that considerable gap. There, of course, continues to be the misuse of terms, people using terms related to narcissism and psychopathy and getting it wrong. Of course, one of the downsides of the increasing awareness that people have, particularly with regard to narcissism, is that some of the terminology bleeds into everyday use and becomes diluted. For instance, lots of people start bandying around the term narcissist, when in actual fact, just because you don't like somebody in the way they've treated you, that doesn't mean that they're a narcissist. Furthermore, of course, many unaware narcissists throw the term around. They don't know what they are, but they have a bit of an understanding about narcissism. And unsurprisingly, when somebody else threatens their sense of control, their own unknown narcissism causes them to accuse the other person of being a narcissist in order to smear them, insult them, and control them. Thus, you have lots of non-narcissists being labelled as narcissists by unaware narcissists. I trust that you followed that, but it becomes problematic. It also means that the terminology is used in a way which isn't effective. This is something that Time magazine has picked up on. It explains in an article by Angela Haupt, if you spend any time online, You've probably picked up a few psychology terms without realising it. Take gaslighting, which recently became so popular that it clinched the mantle of Merriam-Webster's 2022 Word of the Year. Other terms that have crept from the therapist's couch into the public lexicon include love bombing, triggered, grooming, and toxic. Frequently, mental health experts say, when we overuse those words, we also misuse them. Doing so can dilute the meaning of the words themselves. And we know that words have power, says Naomi Torres-Mackey, a psychologist at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York City and head of research at the Mental Health Coalition, a non-profit that aims to end stigma around mental health. If we're very quick to throw labels on something, it can derail nuanced, important conversations and create this idea of an assumed meaning. This is why I repeatedly drum into you the need to look at an extensive range of evidence from a variety of sources over a sustained period of time before making a determination about somebody and how they behave. While terms like gaslighting have existed in therapeutic practice for decades or longer, most only started to become common lingo within the past few years, fueled by use on social media platforms. One viral Reddit post or TikTok video is all it takes for the masses to latch onto a previously overlooked word. Here are some of the examples of misused terms that time has identified. Gaslighting. Perhaps the most often misconstrued word of the past few years. Gaslighting has been widely adopted as a way to describe any act that's insensitive, a lie, or simply a difference of opinion. And of course, that is inaccurate. We see gaslighting being bandied around repeatedly, used by politicians, by people on social media, basically to describe a lie or a difference of opinion, and that's not correct. Gaslighting is where somebody manipulates you into essentially questioning your sanity, your experience, your memory, and your reality. Aware narcissists do this for the full knowledge that we are shifting your narrative to make you uncertain as to what you believe. This, of course, is entertaining in itself, makes you easier to control, and provides us with fuel. Unaware narcissists do it as a consequence of their instinctive response to revise history driven by their narcissism. In order to nullify your threat to control, i.e. your version of events, the narcissist will, where unaware, claim that something else happened, and they genuinely believe it because their narcissism has directed them in that route. That then leads to you questioning your reality and your sanity. So it isn't a difference of opinion. It isn't just simply a lie, although a lie is involved. It's where an individual, habitually and repeatedly, portrays a different course of events, the purpose of which is to nullify your threat to control and to bring you under control and draw fuel. You'll recall, of course, that it happened within the relationship between the married protagonists of the 1944 psychological thriller film Gaslight, from which the term originated. Essentially, it will occur, for instance, where someone insists repeatedly that an event didn't occur, or it didn't happen that way. Gaslighting is there to, of course, pursue the prime aims by causing you to be confused, to make you doubt yourself. Another term that time references is traumatized. It explains you tripped and fell in front of people, how traumatizing. But therapists would prefer you use a more precise term, like embarrassing, mortifying, shocking, or upsetting. Trauma is a serious, often chronic physiological disruption of the nervous system, Martinez says. Again, we see many people talk about it being a traumatic event when simply they received the wrong coffee at Starbucks. That is not traumatizing. This, of course, is the euphemizing of certain behaviors, diluting them, making them seem less serious. Of course, it then ends up trivializing this trauma. Triggered is another one that's identified by time as being a common way to express feeling offended or shocked. For instance, on Reddit, people were apparently triggered by a celebrity's red carpet dress, slow walkers, and a bad scene in an animated movie. a movie rather. However, in its correct sense, being triggered means encountering a reminder of a traumatic experience, followed by a response such as flashbacks, self-harming, or a panic attack. In effect, it often feels like the trauma is happening again. It is not simply becoming offended because somebody's wearing something, and to declare that you've become triggered. That is incorrect. The point is that a war veteran could be triggered by hearing gunshots, leading to distressing flashbacks, or somebody recovering from a substance use disorder might be triggered by seeing a character on TV using their drug of choice. Essentially, the brain and body respond as if they were in the moment again. This causes an emotional and physiological reaction before the person even realizes why they're upset. Next up, narcissist. The article tells us that one of the internet's favourite diagnoses is that someone is a narcissist, which has become shorthand for anyone who appears self-centred or entitled. The term is thrown around so carelessly, says Jacqueline Tenaglia, a licensed mental health counsellor based in Boston. I see narcissism being especially misapplied when it's used to label someone who exhibits qualities that someone might not like. Going back to the point that I made earlier, just because somebody disagrees with you and does so vociferously and does something you don't like does not make them a narcissist. It is, of course, a detailed diagnosis which covers a variety of fields that have to be hit by a strict evidential standard. However, what is interesting is that in this Time article, it explains narcissistic personality disorder is a clinical diagnosis that can involve characteristics such as an exaggerated sense of talent and self-importance, fantasies of power and beauty, a tendency to take advantage of others, and a deep need for attention and admiration. It can also manifest as an inability to cope with criticism, and is most commonly diagnosed in men, although, as I've explained to you, the actual split is closer to 50-50. Interestingly, this article states that treatment typically consists of talk therapy and in some situations medication. This article, which talks about misusing terms, is also misusing information because neither of those things will help. The next is love bombing. The article explains, say two people are newly dating, one is lavishing the other with gifts and compliments. When someone makes grand gestures to the object of their affection, bystanders can be quick to call it love bombing, although it could be just normal excitement. As you know, love bombing is undertaken by a narcissist in order to bring somebody under control by seducing them. It's essentially showering that individual with excessive attention, extravagant trips, which ultimately causes that individual to feel obligated and dependent upon that individual. It is actually rare because it is confined essentially to relationships where somebody is a narcissist. But people often use it just to determine, or rather to describe someone who is being complimentary and buying a few gifts. That isn't love bombing. Love bombing is either a conscious or unconscious need to bring a person under control, doing so through benign means of monopolizing their time, flattering them, giving them great sex, buying them gifts, taking them to interesting and exciting places, mirroring them, essentially treating them like a king or queen, all being done to draw fuel from them and to bring them under control. Next described is toxic. Again, Time explains that people tend to attach toxic to anything or anyone they find upsetting. Your boss is toxic because they've told you off. The barista who made you wait 15 minutes is toxic. However, it ought to be used for truly abusive situations where there is actual harm being caused on a repeated and sustained basis. Torres Mackey describes it in the article, whereby if somebody in your life causes severe emotional damage, that is toxicity. If somebody isn't a good match for you, or they're difficult, that doesn't mean they're toxic. And of course the problem is that using such labels where they're not accurate diminishes their use where they should be used. Grooming is the next one that Time makes reference to, and states that some politicians use this term inaccurately and dangerously to spread anti-LGBTQ misinformation, which then circulates on social media. It's also misused elsewhere online. People on the internet have started declaring that any older person dating a younger one is grooming them. But determining if that's the case requires far more nuance than that. True grooming occurs when someone develops a relationship with a younger person, potentially a minor, with the intention of sexually abusing them. I would say that's not just the only instance of grooming. Grooming can be seen whereby another individual is seeking to control another individual as a consequence of undermining that victim's relationships with family and friends, gaining trust through love bombing, through gifts and attention, in some instances desensitizing them to touch, and that behaving in a way which is causing that person to be brought under their control by repeated application of certain behaviours. It doesn't necessarily have to happen where there is an age gap, but it is one where there is essentially abuse occurring because the interest that's being taken isn't genuine and is done to assert control over that individual. Trauma bond is another that's made mention of here. According to the article, people often assume that trauma bonding is when two people share with each other their experiences of trauma, and that brings them closer. But it isn't that. Trauma bonding actually refers to the connection or attachment between an abuser and his or her victim. An example of that is Stockholm Syndrome, a coping mechanism that occurs when someone develops positive feelings towards their captor or abuser. I would explain to you that the trauma bond is actually part of the addiction, that your addiction causes you to have a bond with your abuser, with the narcissist, and it's driven as a consequence of your emotional thinking, preventing you from analysing the situation properly. Antisocial is mentioned. Some people think that antisocial is the fact that you don't feel like going to a party, and it's often used to indicate a lack of desire to be around other people, but actually that is incorrect. Antisocial personality disorder, as you ought to know from my work, is the clinical term for psychopathy, and it's marked by criminal behaviour, impulsivity, an absence of emotional empathy, a lack of awareness in some instances about the impact upon other people, along with other factors besides. Simply not wanting to be around other people is not being antisocial. The final misused term that Time identifies is trauma dumping. It describes a good venting session as affirming, a relief, the way two people might bond. But pouring your heart out to a friend about all the hard things you're dealing with isn't necessarily trauma dumping, a term popularised apparently on TikTok. The actual definition of this trendy term is sharing specific details about a traumatic experience with somebody who isn't ready or doesn't want to hear it, and particularly is being done in a repeated or unsolicited way, or at an inappropriate time. In effect, somebody who's not recognising boundaries, acting with a sense of entitlement, not showing accountability for their behaviours, lacking emotional empathy because of the conduct that they're engaging in. What is this reminding you of? Thus, these are a number of terms that Time identifies have been repeatedly misused, and they're correct about that. That's why it's so important to ensure that the correct information that I provide to you is generated, shared, and spread across social media as widely as possible. Unfortunately, there are numerous individuals that share absolute nonsense and continue to pump out information which is both misleading and dangerous. In order to counter that, the best thing that you can do is continue to watch my videos and ensure that they're shared as widely as possible so that this misinformation is countered. Thank you for listening.